Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Tim Oakes. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Asian Studies, and I'm really happy to be able to introduce and welcome Tenzin Dickie here for this event today. I just first want to, just some housekeeping first. Since this is a CAS event, we have our ubiquitous sign-in clipboard, and if you could help us just by sending that around and including your name on it, helps us get our information on who attends our events, and that's really helpful for us for a number of reasons. So thanks for doing that. I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for today's event, the Tibet Himalaya Initiative, and the Department of Anthropology here at CU Boulder. And I also want to thank Stan Harsha and the Foothills World Affairs Council and World Denver for making Tenzin Dickie's visit possible today. So Tenzin Dickie is a poet, writer, and translator. Her work has appeared in Cultural Anthropology and the Washington Post Online, Words Without Borders, and Modern Poetry and Translation, among other places. She's also featured in the forthcoming Tibetan Reader by the Duke University Press, and she is editor of the Treasury of Lives, a online open access biography encyclopedia of Tibet, Inner Asia, and the Himalayan region. She's also the editor of the book Old Demons and New Deities, or Old Demons, New Deities, which is the first English language anthology of modern Tibetan fiction published in the West. This is a collection of 21 contemporary Tibetan short stories on the lived experiences of ordinary Tibetans today as they grapple with the experience of exile and occupation. In the introduction, Dickie quotes the writer Junot Diaz, and I'll quote him here as well because I really enjoyed this quote and I thought it was really appropriate. Now, Diaz writes, "You know how vampires have no reflection in the mirror? If they want to make a human being a monster, or if you want to make a human being a monster, deny them, at the cultural level, any reflections of themselves." End of quote. This has been a large part of the Tibetan experience of occupation and exile, and Old Demons and New Deities goes some way in providing some of that reflection. And a couple of weeks ago, we also had Sarin Chakya here, who also gave a talk about the role of photography in popularizing the image of the 13th Dalai Lama in early 20th century Tibet. And I was thinking about that as about that quote by Diaz. Another important mode of reflection that was shared with us in that talk. So I want to share with you a passage from Lowell Cook's review in the Los Angeles Review of Books of Old Demons, New Deities. I think it captures well the scope of the work. So, combining the politics of China, the flashing lights of modernity, the pressures of tradition, and the joys and sorrows of exile, there are countless old demons and new deities in the mandala of Tibetan literature. This book is the first of its kind and presents a little-known literature that few readers in the West have been able to access. With the well-crafted translations of this collection, Tibetan literature takes a step forward onto the global stage to tell its story of the horrors of the modern world, as well as the simple joys of life. End of quote. A 2014-2015 Fellow of the American Literary Translators Association, Tenzin Dickie holds an MFA in Fiction and Literary Translation from Columbia University, where she was a Hertog Fellow, and a BA in English Literature from Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming Tenzin Dickie.
Hi. Welcome, and thank you so much again, Tim, and especially Stanley, for bringing me here. I am very happy to be here and happy to see some old friends. So I first want to start by reading briefly from Old Demons, New Deities, and then talk a little bit, and then we'll have a Q&A. So this is from Winter in Padliko. It's a short story. So it's about a young girl, Hamo, and a boy, Sherab, and this old woman who is like a random old person in their boarding school. So, but some things happen, and then there's this sort of interlude, and then more things happen, and I'm just kind of reading from the interlude. No one knew how old Momo Pasang was, or how she had come to be at Patliko. Some of the older boys said that she was old already when Patliko was founded. The other elders were former cooks and dorm mothers and tailors and seamstresses. They were staff at Patliko or in one of the Tibetan schools. But what was Momo? She seemed to have always been an old woman. The other elders lived in the old people's home by the classroom buildings. Momo, the oldest of them all, lived by herself in a room below the school hall. The other elders were usually fond of students. They sat in the sun, sunning their backs, saying their prayers and chatting, and they often had a smile or a sweet for you when they saw you. Momo never spent any time with the other elders. Whenever you ran into her walking around the school or on her way to the kitchen to pick up her food, she was always alone, muttering what seemed to be curses under her breath. "What's she doing?" Sherab said. She had her cane in one hand, and her other hand was held out for coins, with a small bucket dangling from the wrist. It took us a moment to understand what we were seeing. She was begging. If we had seen her hitch the skirt of her chuppar up and start urinating there in the street, we could not have been more shocked. Certainly, I had seen beggars before in Delhi, in Bangalore, scores and scores of beggars, men, women, children, despairing and dying before one's eyes in the indifferent daylight. My parents, struggling as they were, helped them out when they could. My father always gave to beggars missing a body part, such as an arm or a leg. My mother gave to women carrying babies. But Patlikul was a very small town. There were only the local townspeople, and no one was very well off, neither the Indians nor the Tibetans. But no one needed to beg either. And the thing was, I had never seen a Tibetan begging before. Later, I would realize that there were many other things I had never seen a Tibetan do. I had never seen a Tibetan bus driver, or a honey seller, or a milkman, nor a Tibetan artist, a Tibetan doctor, a Tibetan scientist. Tibetans were only certain things in this exile of ours. We didn't stay to watch Momo Pasang. We fled and got back to school just in time for lunch. After lunch, we were playing marbles behind the classroom buildings when the kulfi man came by. The teacher said the kulfi man made his kulfi with dirty water from the river, but we didn't care about that. He kept it in a cane basket wrapped tightly with sackcloth. He carried the basket on his head, resting atop a long robe of cloth that he fashioned into a sort of turban. Even in winter, he came to the school to sell his kulfi, although most of the children who remained for the holidays had no money. "Kulfi, kulfi," said a voice above our heads. An older boy was out on the ledge. He dropped down with an easy swing and held out one tattered rupee note to the Indian. The kulfi man sat his box on the ground and squatted. With one hand, he began unwinding the turban cloth from his head. He looked even sadder and thinner without it. He cut a large slice of the kulfi with his flat steel spatula, wrapped it in a newspaper page which featured a picture of Hema Malini, and passed it to the boy. We watched the boy break the chunk of kulfi in two like a piece of barfi. He popped a piece into his mouth and ate it hastily, as if it were too hot and burning his mouth. Then, carefully, making sure we were watching, he licked his fingers. He waited for us to say something. "If you don't eat the rest quickly," Sherab said, "the ink will stain the kulfi." "Oh, really? You know, maybe I got too much kulfi. I wouldn't want it to stain. Maybe I should share." Maybe not. Maybe I'll just eat it after all." He grinned as if he had made a clever joke, and we laughed. When an older boy thought he was being funny, you laughed along. He folded the newspaper sheet, held it between his teeth, and climbed out onto the windowsill on the first floor classroom. Rising carefully onto the balls of his feet, he grabbed the ledge and pulled himself up smoothly onto the second floor. He stood up gingerly, dusted his pants, popped the second piece of kulfi into his mouth, and dropped the newspaper. A strip of red paper also fell along with it. We watched the boy climb back inside the classroom. The sheet drifted slowly to the ground and landed. Hema Malini's beautiful face was ruined. Sherab picked up the papers and stuffed them into his pants pocket. After the boy went back inside the classroom, the kulfi man sat and waited for other students, but there were no more buyers. Sherab and I played marbles, watching the kulfi man out of the corner of our eyes. Finally, the Kofi man tapped his wrist, the signal we had been waiting for. We went over, rolled up our sleeves, and held out our wrists to him. He cut 2 small slices of kulfi and placed one on Sherup's wrist and the other on mine. Ruko, he said. It was a word we knew. Wait. Sherup and I began counting out loud. 1, 2, 3. The slice of kulfi lay like a wedge of orange on the transparent skin of my inner wrist, where thin blue lines crossed like railway tracks. 8, 9, 10. First, the kulfi felt like a sliver of ice on my skin, then of fire. Although the slice weighed nothing, it seemed to grow heavier against my wrist, and I felt a dull pain. The outer edges of the kulfi began to sludge. 15, 16, 17. Sherup's face looked pinched. The kulfi man washed first Sherup, then me. A creamy drop rolled off my wrist. At 21, Sherup broke. I'm done, he said, and quickly gulped his kulfi down. I huffed, relieved. Sherup had lasted longer than usual. Angling my face, I brought my wrist carefully up to my mouth and swallowed the kulfi, feeling the sweet, milky taste spread across my tongue. The kulfi man's face didn't change, but I thought he was satisfied. He began to pack up. We watched him tie the rope-like cloth around his head like a Punjabi's bakri. Then he placed the basket on top. I held out my wrist to the sun. Although we knew the word shukriya, we never said it. There was no need to thank the kulfi man. Whatever impulse it was that motivated him, we knew it was not kindness. I thought I would tell you a little bit about my life's journey, which is also my writing journey. So I grew up in the small place, the Tibetan refugee boarding school, which was basically a Tibetan village, depicted in this story, Patliko, in rural North India. And how that school was formed has to do with history and geography, like how many places are formed. So 1959, the Chinese invasion of Tibet is complete. His Holiness the Dalai Lama leaves, and tens of thousands of Tibetans followed him, among them my grandparents and my parents. And what that meant geopolitically was also now India used to be borders with Tibet, but it no longer borders Tibet, right? It borders China. So China encroached a little bit on Indian land, and then there was basically the 1962 Indo-China War, which made the Indians realize, oh, we need to secure our northern and western border. So they wanted to station armies there. They wanted to, bring men and supplies, and there were no roads. And India had now this new influx of all these Tibetan refugees who had no jobs, because Tibetans used to be nomads and farmers, but they had left their land behind, they had left their cattle behind. So my grandparents began working on these road projects that now the Indian government was hiring scores of Tibetans to build roads all along North India, so that later the Indian army could travel along and, they could have their garrisons and whatnot. So that provided a livelihood for the Tibetan refugees coming in. And my grandparents ended up working along a road in North India, and then they ended up working on a dam, which still stands to this day and is a functioning dam. And how my school and my Tibetan Indian hometown was built was, so along the Patliko up to Ladakh area, they needed this whole stretch of highway. And as Tibetan refugees began building that road, they had children, and a daycare was started for the kids of those road laborers. And that daycare later turned into the Tibetan Children's Village School at Patliko, and it became a real boarding school. And it was just a small Tibetan universe in this, in this next to this Indian hamlet, really. In rural North India. And Patlikul, so my parents were teachers there, and I was basically born there, I grew up there, I spent the first 10 years of my life there. And it was a completely Tibetan universe. I mean, all the teachers, all the elders, all the staff, the children, everybody was Tibetan, everybody spoke Tibetan. And the school had a small library, and it was filled with, I mean, it was a really poor school, it was a very poor community. But there was this small library which had ladybird books that aid organizations from the West had donated. So my mother would bring these ladybird books, and I don't know if any of you guys know them, but they're like, I mean, British people would know them, and they're like called ladybird books. I think that's the press maybe, and it's like Thumbelina and like books for kids. So my mother would bring these books home. She had special privileges because she was a teacher. Otherwise, people weren't allowed to take books out of the library. You could only sit there and read them. And she would bring them home and she would translate them for me. And I just loved hearing those stories. I loved listening to those stories. And so when I was 8, my parents left the school, so my brother and I became boarding children. So we entered the dormitories, and my brother and I ended up getting beds next to each other. So at night, lights out at 9 p.m., very strict boarding school. I would then turn to my brother and say, tell me a story, tell me a story. And most of the time he would be like, just go to bed, just go to sleep. But every once in a while he would tell me a story. And these were often stories about Tibetan monks and Indian priests and, like dialectical debates that they had. I found out later a lot of these stories that he's telling me are from, the Tibetan literature and language textbooks that he's reading, that he's being taught in class. So I just grew up really wanting and loving stories, but I didn't yet had a way to access those stories for myself. I couldn't get them for myself. So the really important thing that happened was that winter of when I was 8 years old, my brother and I, during our winter break, we went to Nepal to my aunt's family. And my family was very poor, but my aunt had married into money. So she had this huge building in like the center of Kathmandu in Nepal. And she also had shelves of books, of comic books, which, I mean, I'd never seen, like even our library didn't have, comic books for kids. And the other thing, so for the first time in my life, I had access to these comic books that I could take and I could look at and I could get the story for myself, even though I couldn't yet really read the English. But comic books, you can get the story without really knowing the words. And the other thing that happened was at my aunt's house in Nepal, I mean, I had my first real experience of culture shock. So in India, I just grew up in this completely Tibetan community. And at my aunt's house in Nepal, like the house itself was a multilingual, multicultural experience. My cousins they didn't speak Tibetan among themselves. They spoke English or they spoke Nepali, neither of which I understood. So I loved the house, but I also felt very alienated. And I really turned to the comic books. And by the end of that winter, I'd made that seamless transition from just looking at the pictures to reading the speech bubbles and being able to access words and stories for myself for the first time. So I went back to my boarding school. And then a couple of years later, I switched to another boarding school in Dharamsala. It was a school that's of the same kind, so another Tibetan children's village school in Dharamsala, which is the exile of capital Tibet. And I mean, Dharamsala is a teeny tiny place. Maybe some of you have been there, I know. And back then, you know, it probably had like 40 shops. But to my imagination, it was so cosmopolitan. Like, I mean, it was like Paris, you know? So I got to Dharamsala, and then a very fortuitous thing happened that helped to change the trajectory of my life, which was basically, so I was going to be sent into the younger girls' dorm, but there were no beds in the younger girls' dorms. So there was only one bed available in the older girls' dorms, where all the girls were older. They were all much higher grades than me. So I was sent there, and my bed there, as it turned out, so it's a bunk bed, I was on top. It was by the door, it was by this hallway, where there was one dim yellow bulb that was just kept on the whole night. That light was never turned off at night. And, you know, that light would throw a shadow of light into the dorm through this glass window. And a triangle of it fell on my bed. And through that dim yellow light, I could read perfectly. So I just started, I was already a reader by then, but that was when I really just began to read like a crazy person. So again, boarding school, you know, at night, 9 o'clock, all lights have to be turned out, you all have to go to bed. We had to go to bed, but I would just take my book out from underneath my mattress and then read it. And our dorm mother would come out, like, and I would hear her door opening. And, you know, sometimes I'd be able to hide it, but sometimes not. She would catch me. And she would say, go to bed, you can't stay up and read. And then I would just put my book away, wait until she left. And as soon as she was gone, just start reading again. And this went on for like maybe a few months. And our dorm mother actually was just great, kind, generous woman. I mean, like, she never beat us. She was awesome. So I just kept reading. And after some months of this, she decided, okay, I'm just going to let her read. So every night, I would read for maybe 4 or so hours. So I'd sleep for like maybe 4 or so hours. But for some reason, like during those years, by some weird alchemy, that turned out to be enough sleep for my body, even though now I need like a solid 8 hours or I cannot function the next day. So that was where sort of my reading life began. And I was reading, you know, so I was reading during the day. We would get like maybe an hour after lunch, an hour before dinner. That was the only time that we had to ourselves. Every other hour, half hour was structured. We had tasks, we had study periods, we had cultural activities, we had things. But so I'd read for those hours, and then I had, like, the day belonged to the school, but the night was mine. So I would just read. And I began to read, I mean, Enid Blyton, like all those, you know, the naughty books, all Famous Five. I can see you guys are not very familiar with all this YA British lit. And I would also read, you know, the older girls often read Milton Boone romance novels, Barbara Cartland romance novels. So a lot of books like along those lines. I just read a ton. And I was consuming so much. I mean, so much of what I read was just trash. Like, it was so bad. But I was reading such a high volume of garbage that I managed to squeeze enough nutrients out of this garbage. And I became just steeped in language, and I began to just love words. And not just to love words, but to feel comfortable with them, and to have some kind of command over language and words, which I'd never experienced before in my life. So a few years after that boarding school, then my family moved. We had a big change in my family, and we moved from India to the United States. So I went to high school. I went to high school in the U.S., and because I had so much English already at my command, I did well in high school. And then it was time to go to college, and I was lucky enough to get into my first choice college, which was Harvard. And so at Harvard, I mean, there were like hundreds of majors, liberal arts college. There were lots of majors, and I looked at them and I thought, political science. I'm going to study political science. And the reason I decided to do that was just because the problem of Tibet is a political problem. And my parents had always, they'd been teachers, just sort of like service had been drummed into me. So I thought, I'll study political science and maybe I can do something useful for Tibet. I can do something to help. And so I started studying political science, and I mean, they start you off with like Thucydides, right? And history of the Peloponnesian War, and Athenian democracy. And I mean, I'm a fan of Athenian democracy. We're still enjoying its fruits to this day, even though we'll see if we will continue to in the post-Trump era, hopefully. So I liked Athenian democracy, but reading about it didn't make my blood sing. It was so boring. And I thought, what am I interested in? And of course, I mean, I loved books, I loved novels, I loved reading. I loved British literature, which is sort of what I grew up on. And so I went to the English and American Literature and Languages department, and then switched my major and started reading novels. And realized, yes, this is what I want to spend my days and weeks and months and years doing and reading. And it was around this time that I came across a piece of poetry written by Tenzin Dickie. And that poem is called When It Rains in Dharamsala. And it goes like this. When it rains in Dharamsala, raindrops wear boxing gloves. And it just goes on to describe the rain in Dharamsala, which I knew because I had lived in Dharamsala. And I just thought, I'd never read anything that spoke so deeply to me. I had never, I guess, like I'd read and read and read. I had always been a reader, but that was the first time I read something that made me realize maybe I can be a writer too. Because the thing was, I knew the rain in Dharamsala, but it wasn't just that. I knew Tenzin Dickie, and he was just like me. So I thought, if he could do it, I can try to do it too. And so I sat down and then I wrote a poem. And that's sort of how I began trying to write and trying to be a writer. After college, I went on to work for the Office of Tibet in New York City. So I worked as special assistant to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's representative to the Americas. For a couple of years, I wanted to get some work experience and not go directly onto grad school. But I always knew that I would go on and try to do a Master of Fine Arts because I wanted to pursue reading and writing. So I did that. And then I went on to do my MFA at Columbia. And there I began to try writing more seriously. And Columbia also had this, it was one of the few MFAs that had a translation, like a quite vibrant translation community within the MFA program. And they actually had a literary translation minor. So I thought that was interesting, I'll try it out. And I started taking some classes and, doing like translating for homework, translating some poems from the 6th Dalai Lama and stuff like that. And I guess the thing with translation was I'd always, in Tibetan history especially, like translators were just heroic figures, which I don't think they are in any other culture or history. But for Tibet, translators have always been like those heroic, major heroic figures, and translators even called, like great translators, so and so. Like that's their epithet. That's how they're referred to. So translating had always seemed like just something too big for me to think about. But then when I started doing like small bits of translation, I realized I actually really like it. And also that it's not that hard to do. And it was a way for me to connect not just with my history and my culture and this literature that has 1,000-year history, but also a way to do some active good in the world of having these Tibetan poets and Tibetan writers and make their writing accessible to the English reading public, which is the majority of the world, to get their voice out there, because the majority of Tibetan literature and canon that is translated tends to be religious writings. Very little of the contemporary Tibetan literature is translated. So I started to do that. And in the meantime, I was writing my thesis, like writing my short stories, and what ended up happening was, so I was there to study fiction. I was a fiction student, and then I realized, but actually what I'm writing is like this sort of family history memoir. It's nonfiction. So then I had to get special permission from my department to turn in a nonfiction thesis, even though I was a fiction student. And luckily they let me do that. So that was my main project while I was at Columbia that I was working on, and then doing translation on the side. And eventually I turned in my thesis, and then I had my thesis meeting, which many of you guys know about. And my thesis readers were Margot Jefferson and Philip Lopate. And I remember very clearly what they said to me, because they were like, well, the beginning is really good. This is publishable. Like, you should keep writing this. It's really good. And I was thinking, yes, that's exactly what you want to hear as an MFA student, right? That it's publishable. You can go out and publish. And then they said, but the rest of it. And the rest of it was like 90% of it, like all of it, essentially. The rest of it's just shitty. Like, you need to cross it out and start over. So I went home. I mean, it passed, but like I clearly couldn't really do anything with my main project that I'd been working on. So I went home, I took my thesis, I threw it in the trash, and that was a very symbolic gesture, because later I went back and picked it up out of the trash. And I still have it, and no one will ever see it because it really was trashed. And then I just went walking out in the streets, bawling, walking around my neighborhood. And then I came back and I thought, I need to redo this, but right now I'm just too brain-starved, emotionally exhausted to work on it any longer. And I was going to begin working at my job as editor of Treasury of Lives, which is this biographical encyclopedia that Tim has already mentioned. But I knew, I had my mornings, I had my evenings, I had the weekends, and I wanted to work on something. I wanted to produce something. And that was when I thought, we Tibetans don't have an anthology of modern Tibetan short stories in English. There's Blighted Flowers, which has 4 short stories written by 3 authors, published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, which is an academic press in Dharamsala. There is the University of Hawaii Manoa Journal, which did a collection full of essays and stories and poems with Tibetan writers and other writers too, Chinese and American. There were other things, but there was no there was no anthology of modern Tibetan short stories that were all Tibetan writers in English, written originally in Tibetan and English, and also Chinese, because now these are the languages that Tibetans write in. We write in our native language and we write in foreign language. So I wanted to do that. And I realized that, so in the time I'd been at Columbia, I'd also been working as an editor for Tibet Web Digest, and which is a project of modern Tibet studies at Columbia, and doing translation and publishing and that sort of thing, poetry and short prose things, stuff like that. So I had already built up a pretty good network of friends and of writer friends, and as I thought about who should be in this book, sort of a representative sampling, I realized, I'm either already friends with them or my friends are friends with them, so I can get them to be in this. And I reached out to everyone, and everyone actually was so enthusiastic about it. I was just a beginning writer. I had no book. I had nothing. I was just reaching out to them, sending an email, and who knows? Lots of people, so I didn't expect anything, but everyone wrote back to me saying, yes, of course, I will help you do this. I want to be in this. And there were a few things that were sort of goals for me as I was thinking of this project. I wanted to make sure that I had writers from Tibet and from outside, from exile, from diaspora, from China, from India, from the US, from North America, all the places that Tibetans now live in and write in. So, between Tibet and us, between the writers inside and outside, we have the Great Firewall of China, we have the Himalayan mountains, but at least within the covers of this book, I wanted us to be together. And the other thing that I wanted was, I wanted sort of a fair female representation. Tibetan is a patriarchal society, like many societies, and everywhere you look, in our government, in civil society, in activism, in many places, there's many more men than women. And so in this book, at least, I thought, out of 16 different writers, 4 were women, which is not a great ratio, but a better ratio than normally you would see elsewhere in Tibetan silos, in Tibetan worlds. But we still have more work to do on that, obviously. So that was that. And then the one other thing that I also wanted was, and this is sort of small and petty, but I really didn't want my story to be like the worst story, the weakest story in this book. I don't want people to be like, why was she editing this book? Somebody should have edited her. So luckily, it's, I love most of the stories in this book. A lot of the major, writers that I really admire and love and sort of hold up have agreed to be in it. I love the stories in this book. But I also don't feel like mine is the weakest story, so I'm happy about that. And I'm not going to tell you which I think is the weakest story. So please do not ask me that in the Q&A. And then sort of the one last thing was, I just thought, Tim, you mentioned that Junot Diaz quote about why vampires don't have reflections in the mirror. And if you want to make a human being a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. I just thought, well, if, when I was growing up, I felt like it was very hard for me to find my reflection in the literature. And I wanted, I thought if one, because it's for the world, but it's also for Tibetan youth, it's for Tibetans. And I thought if one Tibetan girl picks it up and reads it and thinks that she has found her reflection in this book, that would be worthwhile. So, thank you. Well, reflection is like such a subjective term, right? But what I mean is, I think when you think of, say, the Tibetan operas and Tibetan, those sort of performances that were being enacted and performed for Tibetan audiences, I mean, that is not really accessible to people growing up, because in Tibet, they perform and they have these roles and they are performing and they're sort of reciting these texts, but a lot of it is no one in the audience, like even the adults, don't understand it. It's almost like performing Beowulf, but not even from the Seamus Heaney version, not even from the Seamus Heaney translation, but from like Old English. It's I feel like you'll notice if you're watching Tibetan opera and you see the audience laugh at like certain things. That's usually when the Joker comes and like he says something, and that's because that thing that he will say often is rendered in the language that we speak. But then all the other sort of recitative texts that they're reciting, it's like old text that very few people can understand. And I feel like, so sure, there's Ajahn Nangsa, right? There's heroines from sort of Tibetan history and Tibetan literature, and why aren't we able to find our reflections in those figures? Because they're Tibetan figures that supposedly lived, but these are from hundreds of years ago, and they're archetypes. Like they're not real living flesh and blood human beings with flaws and virtues, with imperfections and failures as well as perfections. I feel like a lot of what we have, and a lot of what I was able to, like what I did have access to as a kid growing up, which is the Tipa performances, older mythic Tibetan stories, stories from the oral literature. A lot of it is like very archetypical, and it's so different. I mean, school children growing up in America have a book that's like, "Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret," and so. And what we had, we didn't have that. What we had was Beowulf. I think you will find if you have an American kid growing up, they will find it very hard to find their reflection in Beowulf. During the early years, I think there was like Yak Band, but a lot of Tibetan community then was so fragmented. And most of the time, Patlikul and then sort of later lower TCV, they were really sort of like, even though TCV was of course in Dharamsala, but Patlikul especially was really just like a remote silo that was, first of all, there wasn't really much culture being produced at that time. And, as far as literature, like the first Tibetan novel written in Tibetan, produced in exile, was written by my father. And that was in, I'm trying to think, because he went to the US and then came back. And this was in like 1997, something like that, right? And anyone who has ever tried to read Tibetan or learn Tibetan can attest to how difficult it is to read Tibetan. I mean, all I need to tell you guys is there's no word separation. There's syllabic separation, but there's nothing to tell you what a word is. So you really have to do like a lot of that mental work, cognitive work. They call it like the cognitive load, right? So you have to do extra, you have to carry an extra cognitive load while reading Tibetan. So it's really just a way of saying that book was like the first novel that was written and produced in exile. And that would still be it would be accessible to a very high level Tibetan reader, but certainly not to kids. I guess, yeah, what I'm saying is I couldn't find literary reflections. And actually, I mean, as far as even cultural reflections, it was difficult. I see what you're saying but you were surrounded in a Tibetan school. Like, couldn't you look around you and find reflections? And that is one way of looking at reflection. But there's also another way. So when I was in college, James Wood was one of my professors, and I mean, he's like this literary critic god, and I learned how to read from him. And he had this sort of really insightful thing that he said, which was, we can know people in books better than we can know people in real life. And for anyone who loves novels and who has steeped themselves in, like, say, Middlemarch, like, it's true. You can know Dorothea Brooks so much better than you can know people in your life, because, I mean, you see, like, her complete interiority, and you can never do that in life. I'm very happy to tell you of this major translation project that's being initiated by Pimabum and Latsi Library and a bunch of other writers, my father including one of them, writers and translators, who are taking 108 Western classics. And I mean, classics can mean, because I feel like they have Who Moved My Cheese among that 108. So it is not just 1984 and, like books that you would think of. But basically a wide variety of great Western literature into Tibetan, because so few translation generally with Tibetan tends to happen in one channel, right? And we really want it to go both ways to benefit each other. And so that's happening. I myself personally at this, and even though I grew up, I'm not able to translate, unfortunately, into Tibetan. I can only translate from the Tibetan into English. And this is even though I grew up in a completely Tibetan environment. Tibetan is my native language, it's my mother tongue. I grew up speaking it, reading it, but because we're born in exile, it's hard to access. It's just so hard to have complete command over the language in the way that you would want. It's just one of the byproducts of exile. So I can't translate. I don't have the ability to translate into Tibetan, only from the Tibetan into English, which I do because it's very important to me. And you're right that a lot of the Tibetan authors in this are from Amdo. They're not from Tibet Autonomous Region. They're not really from Kham. They're from Amdo. And this is this particular northeastern region of Tibet that is very culturally vibrant and especially linguistically active. And that's where writers tend to come from. And there are many reasons for this. Culturally, it's like Repkong especially has been known to be a hotspot for producing intellectuals and things like that. But I'm translating this one book right now by Pimabum, who's one of the leading Tibetan writers, also one of the writers in this book. And his book actually is just, I had no idea about the story until I started reading his memoirs. And it's basically the story of Tibetan life under the Cultural Revolution. So it's essentially, it's Tibetan scholar literature, which is a genre that hardly exists. I mean, there's so many Chinese books about the Cultural Revolution and about people's experiences, but Tibetan experience of the Cultural Revolution you can probably count on one hand. So Pema Bum's memoir about his teacher, Remembering Dorje Tsering, is about this teacher in their hometown of Repkong in Amdo. And this teacher was essentially able to save Tibetan language in his area during the Cultural Revolution at a time when teaching Tibetan was essentially banned. Kids weren't learning it, schools weren't teaching it, teachers weren't, people weren't touching Tibetan books, like books were being burned. This teacher was able to save Tibetan language by teaching his students Marxist-Leninist literature and Mao Zedong thought in the Tibetan language. He was able to be creative and brave enough to say, I want these kids to be excellent, cadres, and they really have to learn Mao Zedong thought. And to do that properly, they have to know Tibetan language well. They have to know the rules of grammar so that they can read this text. And he was teaching on contradiction in Tibetan. And it was because of teachers like him and a few other teachers who managed to save Tibetan language in Amdo, in northeastern Tibet. And at the end of the Cultural Revolution, for 10 years, all over, Tibetan wasn't really being taught. People no longer knew how to teach Tibetan. There were no Tibetan language teachers available. So that school and the group of students who were taught by Dorje Tsering, and Pema Bum, the writer, is one of them. So Dorje Tsering's teachers were then sent across, not just across Amdo, northeastern Tibet, but across, to TAR, other places, to teach Tibetan language and to resuscitate Tibetan language. So that's one of the ways that Amdo managed to retain Tibetan, right? And then, of course, there was Panchen Lama and his efforts.
I guess I was more curious, is there a different style associated with Amdo now? But maybe there's not enough of a sample size of the others to compare.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. It's because writers from TAR write in Chinese. I would say, though, they definitely, the one thing, from my experience translating Amdo literature, they definitely use a lot of local Amdo words. So I have a very hard time translating, and I constantly need to call up a close friend of mine who's also a translator and a writer, one of the writers in this book, to ask him, hey, what does this mean? What does that mean? And luckily, a lot of the writers also tend to be from Repkong, which is where my friend Tunduptashi is from. Mm-hmm. So, because it is not just Amdo, they often tend to use specific Repkong words, which other places in Amdo don't use. So yeah, there's that. I feel like there's also a certain amount of, there's a lot of absurdist humor among the Amdo authors. And there's a lot of, already, of course, about magical realism and Captain Diddle and, the authors have sort of popularized and brought out magical realism in Tibetan writing. And then there is one other thing I noticed among Amdo writers, Tibetan writers from Tibet, but, that tends to be Amdo writers, is their stories tend to be either they're absurdist or their stories will tend to be sort of curiously unresolved. And I feel maybe that just has to do with Tibetan lives in Tibet are unresolved. There's a lack of agency. Tibetan writing in exile, Tibetan exile writers, the one sort of major inescapable thing about us is we're essentially writing in a foreign language, all of us. Our native tongue is Tibetan, and for some of us, for some of us, our native tongue, really actually is Tibetan. And then there's others who grew up sort of speaking more English, and often are much more fluent and feel much more comfortable in English. And that's the language that they write in as well, and will often consume all of their reading in. But for many of us, we grow up bilingual. We consume English literature, we consume Tibetan literature, we consume other literature, but we write in English, which is to us a foreign tongue, even though now it has become a mother tongue of a sort. And the thing about exile is you're not at home. Edward Said said about exile, it's that unhealable rift between a human being and their native place. You are forever separate. So that creates a burden and a difficulty and a challenge, and perhaps it also creates opportunity. One thing it definitely does for us is we have much more Tibetan writers writing from exile, writing in English. We have much more ready access to global literature, with the majority of which you can find in English, than Tibetan writers writing. Well, in Chinese now there's a fair amount, but in Tibetan there's very little, growing steadily, and hopefully it will continue to grow. But not enough. So that's sort of one major thing. And then I guess the other thing is a lot of Tibetan exile writers, have multiple cultural influences. They grow up with Tibetan Gesar stories and Milarepa and knowing about the six Dalai Lama's poetry and all of that. But you also grow up, especially if you grew up in India and the subcontinent, where the majority of Tibetan exile writers come from. You grow up with Bollywood. You grow up learning about Mahabharata and the Pandavas and all of that. So there's a lot of different influences. But I feel like perhaps the sort of major, the major thing is just that separation from our mother tongue, which I'm still thinking about the ways that it affects and influences our writing, and affects and influences our psyche, which then manifests, in our writing. And as far as Tibetan writing from the PRC, so there's Tibetan writing from Tibet, which essentially now you could say has been reduced to Tibetan writing from Amdo. Sadly. And there's Tibetan writing from, where Sarah lives in Beijing, she writes in Chinese, Ale, and I do think you can call that a version of exile writing. They're writing in Chinese, they are writing under certain restrictions, they always have to be navigating certain shifting realities. So, they're navigating on the inside these conditions. And then on the outside, we're navigating different political spheres, linguistic challenges, cultural challenges, all of that. I would add to that, in this book, there's Pema who came from Tibet. When did he come? Was it maybe the 90s? Anyway, he writes in Tibetan. Dunduk Dashi came much later in the 2000s. And yeah, they are Tibetan writers. Maybe now some people would call them exile writers, but they're not. They came from inside Tibet, from inside Amdo. So they're Tibetans from inside. They're also Tibetans from, like many of us, I think, we because of the reality of our situation, we have such a multiplicity of identities, right? I mean, I'm a Tibetan writer. I'm a Tibetan Indian writer. I'm a Tibetan American writer. So likewise, yeah, there are many different kinds of exiles. And yeah, hopefully, I mean, well, Tim, now you know that there are these writers in this book. Maybe they could come out for a talk. I think they would be happy to. Yeah. And their stories are great. You know, if you look at writing from the UK or like America from a long time ago, there's all kinds of different spelling variations. There's like stylistic conventions and things like things have not really been canonized yet, and there's so many different variants. And I feel like that's sort of what we're seeing right now, just this incredible fertile period. And a big part of that, I think, is because for such a long time, I mean, Tibetan literature was produced by such a minority of people, right? I mean, a lot of it was texts written by monks for monks. And even in monastic settings, a majority of the monks, like maybe they knew how to read, but they didn't know how to write. Writing was for a really small elite. And even if you did write, I mean, it was the printing was so expensive. Like big monasteries had presses, some rich aristocratic estates had presses, but they weren't like, they weren't really like independent presses. There wasn't like a roaring poetry scene. And now we have many, we're people who are writing different kinds of writing, like not just, namthar, hagiographies, and epistles and texts on metaphysics and Buddhist philosophy. We have people who are writing like sex poetry, people who are writing just different kinds of literature. So that's one thing. And then the other, and it's incredibly exciting to see. And the other thing is, Tibetan as a language is, I mean, there's, for anyone who knows and has studied Tibetan, especially central Tibetan dialect, right? There is this honorific register, and then there's your ordinary register. And for books, for so many things, there's different words. And one is the honorific and one is the regular. Like for books, for water, for rosary, for many things, and verbs, like all of these will have the honorific register and the non-honorific version. And I feel like a lot of what used to happen in literature was sort of that honorific, like high status writing. And now we're really able to see more of just, ordinary writing. Like back then, even like an Amdo Lama writing, like he wouldn't really necessarily have been writing in his local Amdo dialect. Like he would have been writing in like an Usang, Shesa, right? So now different registers are I feel like there's more of that emerging. In terms of the writing that I'm translating, I feel like I see very little Shesa in what I'm translating. It's more just your ordinary local, like sort of folksy Amdoke. And then actually, even that, I feel like different writers maybe will have different ways of sort of standardizing their vernacular. And right now, the writer that I'm working with most is Pimabom, right? And for Tibetan writers, I mean, there's people who sort of tend to speak Amdoke, and then there's people who tend to speak Yike, which is like, so there's the local variant that they'll speak, and then there's sort of like the textual language that they'll speak. So Pimabom, for instance, in his descriptions, in his text, it's the textual language, and then in his dialogue, it's the local vernacular. And so I feel like, I mean, that's sort of great marriage between those two, because that is sort of how he's able to preserve the dialogue and the vernacular. And the reason that one of the reasons we see that now is because there is more Tibetan short stories, there's Tibetan novels. I mean, before, it wasn't really necessary to preserve local vernacular dialogue, because people were constantly, I mean, it was like epistles to my religious teacher. It was poetries on my religious experience of gaining realization. It was things like that. And now, in these stories, you'll have somebody sexting someone, and then like that has to be rendered. And it's great to see that.